Hello, welcome to the Liverpool Stories Podcast with me, Dale Roberts. If this is your first time tuning in and watching this podcast, firstly, I'll just say I mainly make these podcasts for video. So YouTube's always the best platform to kind of watch it on. But if you are listening on Spotify, I probably will be quite descriptive with my wording. But as I say, do bear in mind that it's mainly for YouTube. But my name's Dale Roberts. If you're not aware, for the past 11 years of my life, I've made a full-time living talking about the Beatles. Every year I take roughly about 13,000 tourists around Liverpool talking about the Beatles. I've designed and delivered tours that have been considered among the world's best, I'm very proud to say. And I also co-own George Harrison's childhood home. So many of the other podcast episodes that you might have seen are set in George Harrison's house, in which I interview various different guests. But this one obviously isn't in George's house. I'm currently outside, and for those who can't recognise it, who've maybe never been, I'm currently inside Strawberry Field. Strawberry Field, where do you even begin with Strawberry Field? Well, firstly, one thing I will say is I'm currently stood inside Strawberry Field. Anyone who ever visited Liverpool and visited these Beatles locations before 2019 did not have the ability to do this. They could not step behind the wall of Strawberry Field. What they would do is they'd all come to Strawberry Field in Liverpool, and they were met by the Strawberry Field gates. So here I am. I'm now outside Strawberry Field, and I'm stood outside the gates of Strawberry Field itself. So here you have the gates, famous iconic gates. By the way, the replica gates, it says that behind it. In no way is that hidden from guests who come and visit. These are replica gates. You may have watched a previous video that I've done about Penny Lane. Penny Lane, the second the song Penny Lane was released, which was released on the same day at the same time as Strawberry Fields, it was a double A-sided single. The second Penny Lane was released, the Penny Lane street signs became the most robbed items in the city. However, at Strawberry Field, it was a very similar issue. There'd be multiple... Hello again, Chris. You're right, mate. Okay. I'm doing loads of videos today, pal.
Did I ruin it for you earlier on?
See you later.
Don't leave a word, he says.
Thanks, mate. Cheers, Chris. Oh, what a guy. Lovely fella. Yeah, it was a similar issue. Penny Lane, the street signs kept getting pinched. But at Strawberry Field, the gates had 2 successful robbery attempts to my knowledge. Each time, the gates weren't actually robbed for being the gates of Strawberry Field. It seemed like they were robbed for scrap metal, because on at least one of those occasions, a scrap metal merchant recognised the gates and brought them back to Strawberry Field. So the gates would end up being placed into storage. They'd be stored at the Liverpool Cathedral. And then in 2019, they would rebuild and reopen Strawberry Field. And as part of the grand opening of it, they would tour the city with the gates of Strawberry Field on the back of a truck. It was quite cool. But I'm talking about Strawberry Field. I've just left Strawberry Field, and Strawberry Field to me is very normal, because I visit it at least 9 times a week, okay, on various different tours. So I tour guide on the world-famous Magical Mystery Tour. Every year we take about 80,000 people to the gates of Strawberry Field. We don't go inside of it. But I also do private tours, in which on private tours I do take people inside Strawberry Field. These days, in 2026, it's a John Lennon exhibition. They also have a bandstand inside Strawberry Field for live music. They have a cafe, they have a gift shop. It's a beautiful place. But the most important thing is that all the money that they make inside Strawberry Field goes back into training up young adults with mild to moderate learning difficulties, or with barriers to employment, more specifically. So they do great work for the community at Strawberry Field. But that's what it is these days. Why on earth did John Lennon write a song all about Strawberry Fields? Well, let's go back. Originally Strawberry Field, firstly, was it a field of strawberries? We can assume it probably was. But no one actually knows that for certain. We can only assume it was a strawberry field based on the fact it's called Strawberry Field. Whenever I've looked back at old maps, which I have done, I actually bought a map a good few years ago. I was at a flea market and I found an old map of this area, and it just says Strawberry Field. So you can assume it was a field of strawberries. However, we know its history quite well, to the point where it was owned by a guy called A.C. Mitchell. Eventually, further down the line, the land would be gifted to the Salvation Army. This is roughly around 1936 that they would take Strawberry Field, an old Gothic manor house, and lovely grounds and gardens. They would turn it into an orphanage. And when they first opened it up, it was an all-girls orphanage specifically. It wouldn't be until quite a few decades later that they started allowing boys into the orphanage. And there's a very famous image. It was the first person to ever have his photo taken with the gates of Strawberry Field, of a young lad stood there just at the gates. So they started taking in boys, and they also, due to the time it was, they'd also taken unmarried mothers. So Strawberry Field was an orphanage from 1936 all the way up until roughly 2005 when it shut down. It shut down to make way for the foster care system in this country. Kids in our country, and I think in many places around the world, are no longer looked after in communal settings, but they're looked after in family settings instead through the foster care system. So Strawberry Field was shut down in essence by 2005. It sat there as an empty derelict field until 2019. That's when the Salvation Army reopened Strawberry Field as a training centre for young adults with disabilities. It's a beautiful place, as I say. But when the song was released in 1967, everyone assumed it was about a psychedelic field of strawberries. They would all descend upon Strawberry Field, and when they arrived, they were met only by the locked gates of an orphanage. That is why the gates of Strawberry Field are quite iconic. Beatle fans would travel from all around the world just to see and touch the gates of Strawberry Field, you know. So the gates became quite iconic. It was the only part of Strawberry Field that the fans could actually physically touch. But the gates, whether they are replica gates or original gates or anything, the gates didn't really mean anything to John Lennon. They were significant to the fans because it was the only part of Strawberry Field he could see or touch. For John Lennon, he would specifically climb over the back wall of Strawberry Field because it was closest to his house. So here's the thing. People have analysed Strawberry Field for many years. Why on earth was John Lennon hanging around in there? I believe he was singing about a field at the back of his old house. But he was specifically singing about this field at a time when he couldn't possibly come back and visit his old childhood home again. Because, listen, if you're watching a video like this, I can only assume that maybe you're a Beatle fan or a bit curious as to what the phenomenon of the Beatles was. So let me just firstly say, the Beatles weren't necessarily just like One Direction. I've heard many people compare them to them. They weren't like One Direction. They weren't like Oasis. The Beatles weren't just a rock and roll group or a popular music act. The Beatles were a cultural phenomenon. They actually had a name for it. It was called Beatlemania. Beatlemania seems to have begun in Liverpool in places like the Little Town Hall, where girls just radically started screaming, almost supernaturally. Now, don't get me wrong, this had already happened with the likes of Elvis. It slightly happened with the likes of Buddy Holly. But when it happened with the Beatles, this wasn't just an isolated incident in the United States. This was kids in the UK screaming out, you know. This was kids then across Europe starting to scream. And with the Beatles, it took on an entire new life of its own up until the point where it got called Beatlemania. And Beatlemania, as I say, was a cultural phenomenon that legitimately changed the world. Of course, we all know, especially those in the Beatles industry and people who study the Beatles played on the Ed Sullivan Show in the United States of America on the 9th of February 1964, and they played to over 73 million people live. And that was a huge moment in history, because Beatlemania was born then on an international scale, and it took over the United States of America. So this is a huge cultural phenomenon, and when I say that as well, Beatlemania then isn't just like, oh, screaming girls. Beatlemania opens up the floodgates for a new wave of music, which is the British invasion period of pop, where bands like the Beatles, the Searchers, Jerry and the Pacemakers, but also the Rolling Stones and the Who and many of the other great artists, British artists, went over and dominated the US pop charts. It forced the United States of America to really up the game when it came to music, and it really transformed the world. The 1960s, nothing was ever the same after the 1960s. And of course, Strawberry Field forever played a major part in defining the new psychedelic sound and everything by the late 1960s. But why I'm telling you all this is, John Lennon was singing Strawberry Fields Forever at a field at the back of his house, but specifically at a time when he couldn't possibly come back and visit, because John Lennon's Aunt Mimi was forced out of her house. She no longer lived in the house that John Lennon was brought up in. So here's where it gets a little bit more complex. What I'm doing right now, by the way, is I'm walking from Strawberry Field to the childhood home of John Lennon. I'm literally just walking around the corner. And I'm also, by the way, I'm having a very slow stroll. I'm not speed walking here. It literally was around the corner. So, however, John, it was even quicker for him to get to Strawberry Field, because right now I'm here at the bottom end of Vale Road. Vale Road is a hidden gem in the story of the Beatles. No tourists ever tend to visit Vale Road, and the reason why is because you won't find this on like your major tourist trail or anything like that. But Vale Road is specifically where John Lennon used to climb into Strawberry Field from, because his house backed onto Vale Road. Not only that, he had 3 different friends who lived on Vale Road. When he set up his band, the Quarrymen, the first place they ever played a rehearsal gig was in Pete Shotton's back shed on Vale Road. When Paul McCartney would meet John Lennon, 6th of July 1957 at the Woolton Village Fete, he would meet up with Ivan Vaughan, which Ivan Vaughan was the guy who was the mutual friend between John and Paul. He'd meet up with Ivan Vaughan here on Vale Road. Vale Road played a huge part in the story of the Beatles. But I'm going to stand on the corner of Vale Road to tell you the story before I get to John Lennon's house. Now, John Lennon, he had an incredibly complex childhood. You see, right now I'm stood in what is a middle-class suburb in Liverpool. John Lennon sang a song, Working Class Hero. He wasn't that working class, you know. It's undeniable that John's upbringing was not as working class as he made it out to be. And people can debate it all day, because I still, as a Beatle guide, always tell people that they were 4 working class lads from Liverpool who changed the world. John identified as working class, so I'll let him have it. I'm not one to question it, especially a lad who was brought up in wartime Britain, growing up playing on bomb sites, you know, with rationed food throughout his childhood. So I in no way can kind of question John Lennon's identity as working class, but one thing I can say is Woolton is a very posh suburb of Liverpool. It's a nice area, lovely big semi-detached houses. Now, I'm saying this because this is where John Lennon was brought up, but he did not have a good time when he was growing up, by any stretch. He was born 9th of October 1940. Not long after John Lennon was born, his father, Alf Lennon, he seemingly abandoned the family. And when I say seemingly abandoned them, he went off to sea. He was a merchant seaman. He went off to sea as a sailor, and when he was off at sea, he got drunk one night, and as he was walking down the street drunk, he smashed through a shop window because he saw a mannequin in the window, and I assume he was having a laugh with his mates. He broke through this shop window, he started dancing with the mannequin, and he got arrested for being drunk and disorderly. Now, this would have been like, you know, it would have been a fine, it would have been a slap on the wrist, a small prison sentence maybe, but he'd forgot all of his paperwork. So he ended up basically being kept in this prison cell for quite some time, and then he ended up becoming a stowaway on the ships to get back to Liverpool. He couldn't make his way back. In essence, this takes a good few years, by the way, and this seems like such a silly thing that John Lennon's dad smashed the shop window. But if he didn't smash that shop window, this entire story is different, and John's upbringing is different as well. So who knows if we ever end up with the Beatles because of this. I'm sharing this with us because in the meantime, John Lennon's mother was Julia, and Julia Stanley, Julia Lennon, of course, she was married to Alf, but Julia Stanley, that was her family name. She was from a family of all sisters, and all of a sudden Alf has went missing. He's not sending any letters back, and no pay slips as well, for a period of time. So Julia fears that he died or was off living a sailor's life, so naturally she moves on. But when I say naturally she moves on, she actually she has a relationship with a British soldier by the name of Taffy Adams, and she ends up getting pregnant to this soldier. Now, of course, this is the shame of the family all of a sudden. You're talking 1940s, Great Britain. Julia's pregnant outside of wedlock while she's still technically married. He might be missing, he might not be contacting, but she's still married. She's the shame of the family, and it's a sad reality that she has so much pressure put on her by her family that she gives up the baby for adoption. So she gives birth to a baby, Victoria, and she puts the baby up for adoption. The baby would grow up to become known by the name Ingrid Peterson, by the way. And John Lennon, to my knowledge, would never know that he had this sister throughout his life. Quite tragic, really. So she gives birth, baby gets put up for adoption, and then what happens? Alf comes back. He claims he's been locked up overseas. He tells Julia, the story, whether it's full or in part, he tells her the story. But Julia doesn't believe him and wants nothing to do with him, as well as the fact that I have no doubt about it, she had the family pressure behind her, and she probably had elements of shame about the situation, especially given to her by the family. So Julia kicks Alf out, but the pressure from the family that surrounds her means that Mimi, her older sister, really puts pressure on her to get back with Alf. So much pressure that she ends up sitting down. She chats to Alf quite regularly. Alf vents his frustrations to Mimi to the point where one day Alf kidnaps John. Now, this story is overly dramatised in films like Nowhere Boy, but what seems most likely is he does take John further north to Blackpool. He goes to his brother's house. He's in Blackpool. Julia doesn't know that he's there, although Mimi, I believe, does know that he's there. Eventually, they end up going to Blackpool. Julia confronts Alf, and John eventually is giving some sort of choice. Now, whether this choice, again, is overly dramatised or not is almost irrelevant, but John, from that moment on, never sees his father again, or at least not until Beatlemania breaks out and Alf tries to cash in on John's newfound fame by releasing a single of his own. He has this incredibly complex childhood. This is before the age of 4. Then, all of a sudden, he's back in Liverpool with his mother, Julia, and Julia, she's then told by Mimi that she's living in sin, because Julia finds herself a new partner. His name's Bobby Dykins, by all accounts, quite a nice gentleman, but he does not have the approval of the family because Julia's still married to Alf. So all of a sudden, Julia is found in this situation where she's being condemned by her family. Mimi is desperate to have John, and by the way, Mimi's already looking after John quite regularly anyway. But Julia's about to move in with Bobby Dykins, and they're only moving into a 1-bedroom apartment at that time. So all of a sudden, she's told she's living in sin. She's told that there's no chance that she can bring up John in that situation, and Mimi threatens to call social services unless Julia gives John over to her. I think Julia's forced into it. I don't think Julia is this enemy or bad person that people make her out to be. She's forced into a situation that's really quite tragic through a massive amount of circumstances and situations that take place. But what she does is she decides to give John to her older sister Mimi to bring him up instead. Mimi, however, lives here in number 251 Menlove Avenue, a named house called Mendips. This is where John Lennon was actually brought up. There's actually a plaque on the front that says John Lennon, musician and songwriter, lived here from 1945 to 1963. Now, I tell quite a lot of people that's actually most of his entire life. I tell people that because he was already here quite often before 1945 with his Aunt Mimi. The problem we have is from roughly 1958 onwards, John Lennon's actually bouncing around multiple different flats in the city centre, places like Gambia Terrace. He ends up moving to Faulkner Street as well. And of course, as anyone knows, by 1960, he's already in Hamburg. By 61, he's touring. By 62, he's touring the country. By 63, the Beatles are actually becoming quite a gigantic name. And by 1964, that's it. Mimi's out of the house. There's no chance she can live here anymore. So that's the details there of kind of John's tragic upbringing to get him to the age of 5 years of age. But this is where John Lennon's brought up. The top right-hand window of the house, by the way, was John Lennon's bedroom. He wrote his first ever song in that bedroom, a song called I Lost My Little Girl. Oh, no, sorry, he didn't write that. He wrote his first ever song in that bedroom, a song called Hello Little Girl. That was later a hit for the Foremost. Jerry and the Pacemakers covered that song as well. So that was John's room. He wrote Please Please Me in that room as well. He wrote a few of the songs, but he wasn't allowed to play the guitar inside the house. His Aunt Mimi, by all accounts... Hello, Ian. You all right, mate? How are you, mate? Okay, good. That's it, mate. Yeah, his Aunt Mimi, by all accounts, she loved and cared for John. If people, my personal opinion on it, what I actually think is she wanted John a bit too much. I think John grew up feeling like he was unwanted, but in reality, he was wanted so much by everyone around him. His own dad kidnapped him, his mum was desperate to have him as well, but his Aunt Mimi, in essence, forced the situation, which meant that she had John. Everybody wanted John, throughout his entire life as well. Everyone seemed to want John Lennon. He was desperately wanted, but equally, something in that meant that he felt really unwanted. It's so tragic, it doesn't make any sense. Much like John feeling working class, even though he was brought up in the middle class suburbs of Liverpool, there's so much that's very confusing about John's upbringing, and that's one of the reasons why he's such an interesting character as well. But I'm telling you all this because John was brought up by his Aunt Mimi. She was very strict, very stern. She loved and cared for John, but she didn't care for his music. Whenever John Lennon was caught playing the guitar at home, his Aunt Mimi would catch him and say, "John, the guitar's all well and good, but you'll never make a living out of it." A quote which I think is one of the greatest quotes in history, especially when you consider Mimi was forced out of this house, because eventually there was screaming girls outside the house day and night. Beatlemania forced her away from her own house. I say her own house. Mimi also had this facade and confusing nature of her own life where she basically squatted in this house, at least for the first few years of living here. Of course, the war had taken place, loads of houses were sat there empty and derelict, so the laws were very much relaxed on things like squatters' rights at that particular time. So Mimi, by all accounts, actually just climbed over. She stayed in the house until eventually someone tried to kick her out of it. But she'd lived there for so long, there was no legal precedent to kick her out. So she paid a very small sum of money to actually move in to number 251 Menlove Avenue. So that's something that John would not have known of throughout his life. He would have thought of his Aunt Mimi as being this stalwart, very strict and stern and upright and prim and proper. But at the same time, years later, we'd find out that Michael Fishwick, who was one of the lodgers who stayed in Mendips, was actually having an affair with John's Aunt Mimi. John wouldn't know about that either. So there's so much that in John's childhood that seems complex and confusing. But in reality, everything changes for John at 15 years of age. His Uncle George passes away. That devastates John, of course. His Uncle George was like a father figure to him. While Mimi's strict and stern, it does seem like his Uncle George was more of a fun character who was happy and upbeat. John is growing up, spending time with his mum. His mum's coming around to the house all the time to visit him. But she's still reasonably distant, but by the time he gets to sort of 15 years of age, he would go on to say his mum was like his best friend. They'd started to rekindle a relationship, and that relationship very much seemed to be centred around rock and roll in many ways, because his Aunt Mimi didn't care for his guitar playing, but his mum loved him playing the guitar. She'd actually teach him how to play the guitar. She'd teach him his first chords, his banjo chords. She'd buy him his first guitar by all accounts, although that's quite a controversial one in terms of did Mimi buy it or did Julia. Mimi always claims that she bought John's first guitar, you see. But Julia starts becoming this very active presence in John's life. They're playing music together, they're loving the music, and all of a sudden it gets to the July of 1958. The Quarrymen have already been formed. Julia's encouraged John to set up the Quarrymen. John's met Paul, and this is the 15th of July, 1958. John Lennon's mother comes round to the house. Now, a few days prior, they've recorded their first ever song. On the 12th of July 1958, the Quarrymen recorded a song called In Spite of All the Danger, and That'll Be the Day. It was on a shellac disc, and each of them kept it for a week. And the first person to get this record was John. He had the record for the first week. But within that first week of him holding In Spite of All the Danger, the first record that they ever made, his mum comes round to the house. And John's out. He's actually went round to his mum's house. No one's ever said this, and I've never read it in any book or anything like that, but I do feel, and maybe I'm just being over sentimental with it, I think John had went round to his mum's house to play the song. I think he would have told his mum he was recording the song, and she was wanting to hear it, he was wanting to play it, so he went round to hers. But simultaneously Julia went round to Mendips to go and visit John, and she sat waiting for him to come back for a few hours, and eventually she just got fed up of waiting, so she left the house. But unfortunately, her bus stop was on the other side of Menlove Avenue, just on the other side of Vale Roads, just over there. At the minute, we've got some roadworks taking place. But the bus stop was on the other side. By the way, for anyone who is interested in history, things like bus stops don't tend to change, neither do grids on the floor. You know, they tend to be little pieces of infrastructure that you can look for to really get a glimpse into the past, even though the roads will change, the bus stops will change, the locations and the infrastructure don't tend to move that much. But Julia went out to go and get to her bus stop. Now, right now you can see it's a bit of a junction. You can pull out from Vale Road straight across through the side. But back then, you had tram lines that ran through the middle. And you know, listen, by 1958, they were pretty much disused, tram lines by that point anyway, but you'd have big hedges and bushes, and Julia seems to cross over, and maybe she just doesn't see from the other side, or maybe she's distracted. We'll never know. But what we do know is she stepped out into the road, and as she gets to the other side, she's hit and killed by a car driving along the road at speed. The person driving the car was a local trainee policeman called Eric Clegg, and it devastates John. Mimi starts pushing the belief that he was drunk at the time as well. There's no proof of that. John later does echo that. He's interviewed over by someone in the United States, I forget who it was. And he says it was an off-duty trainee drunk policeman who ran over his mother. Now, I think that was just John mimicking what his Aunt Mimi was saying about it, but Mimi was devastated. She ran out of the house to go and see to Julia. It seems like she was pretty much dead on impact. Why I'm saying this though on the top end of Vale Roads, another lad lived here, Nigel Wally, and Nigel Wally actually was chatting to Julia. He was the last person to chat to her alive, and he was good friends with John. And as Nigel has walked up Vale Road, he said bye to Julia, and Julia's then stepped out to the road. Nigel would go on to say that he felt like John would blame him for it, because from that moment on, John and Nigel Wally were not that close anymore, which is really quite sad to consider. But one thing absolutely is true, is that John, from that moment on, from the moment he lost his mum, everything seems different for him. You know, he's already a troubled lad. He gets into trouble throughout his school life and everything, but the second he hits 17 and his mum passes away, he's absolutely a wreck from that moment on, you know. So this is the interesting thing with John's childhood. We're only up to the age of 17. He's already a wreck. You know, he's complex character who's been through so much, and then all of a sudden he's in the art college, he's drinking a lot heavier, he's with Cynthia Powell, who he forces to make look like Bridget Bardot, and he's getting into all sorts of mischief. And his friend at that time, Stuart Sutcliffe, of course, and they go over to Hamburg a few years later, and Stuart stays there. Stuart passes away due to a brain aneurysm, devastates John once again. He starts feeling like everyone who's close to him is passing away or is met by disaster. He then becomes a Beatle. Never enjoys the fame. John hated the fame of Beatlemania. He really didn't like it. And then all of a sudden, Strawberry Fields Forever is released. And Brian Epstein passes away. Devastates John again. That leads then to the breakup of the Beatles. You know, people always ask me what led to the breakup of the Beatles. People blame Yoko Ono all the time, but I think Brian Epstein's passing is the single biggest catalyst that breaks up the Beatles. Why do I believe that? I think I have very good right to believe it, especially recently I was on a podcast with Jerry Marsden's family. And if you're unaware of Jerry Marsden, they were a great Liverpool band, 3 number ones, famously You'll Never Walk Alone, one of the most famous football anthems in history. But I was on a podcast and I was sat with Jerry Marsden's wife, and I said to her, when Brian Epstein passed, did that lead to the breakup of Jerry and the Pacemakers? And she said, yeah, it seemed to be a major catalyst from that moment on. The lads didn't find it fun anymore. And I found it very interesting to see the similarities between the other Merseybeat artists then and the fact that the Beatles really started to see their downfall from the moment Brian passed. I think Brian was the glue that held it together. But Brian passes away. Not long afterwards, of course, the Beatles start going through a very public breakup. John loses his best friend, Paul McCartney. In the process, they start writing the world's first ever diss tracks against each other, don't they? With John writing How Do You Sleep? And very public breakup, very public fallout. John's very much demonised as well in the press at that time. He's, of course, becoming incredibly political in the early 1970s. And during the 1970s, he never had a number one, by the way, never had a number one hit single while he was alive. And then in the mid-1970s, he becomes a stay-at-home dad. That seems to be the only point in John's life where he finds genuine peace He's staying at home as a dad, baking bread, and he talks about it in interviews about how much peace he was finding at that time. But then when he makes his big return back to music in the December of 1980, John's shot and killed outside the Dakota building in New York City. John only lives to be 40 years of age, and most of those 40 years are on this road, Menlove Avenue in Liverpool. I always think, I love John. Complex character, massively complex. But I wouldn't want to trade position with him in any way whatsoever. He had such a devastating, tragic childhood in so many ways, tragic life as well. But I'm saying this because we're walking from Strawberry Field to John's house. Now I'm walking from John's house back to Strawberry Field. Why did John write the song Strawberry Fields Forever was the big question. He was singing about the field at the back of his house. But for years, many people have assumed that John Lennon wrote Strawberry Field because he felt so abandoned, so he felt so isolated, he felt so alone. And maybe there's some credence in that one, in as much as in the original lyrics of Strawberry Fields Forever. In the original lyrics of Strawberry Fields, he sings, "No one I think is on my wavelength." So it does seem like he's singing in a sort of no one understands me kind of way. But the reality of it was, Strawberry Field was a field at the back of John's house. There was also an all-girls orphanage. Pete Shotton was one of John Lennon's best friends when growing up, and Pete Shotton is very much convinced that John Lennon was just in that orphanage to chat to the girls. I don't think he's necessarily wrong. Of course I don't. He was one of John's best friends. He was John's best friend when growing up. It makes sense that he was actually telling the truth. So it does seem that Strawberry Field, for John, was a place where he was going to chat to the girls. Was he feeling isolated and alone? Yeah, he probably was, based on everything we know about his childhood, but I think he was going in there to chat to the girls. As well as the fact that at the back of his house, there was two things. One, the back bedroom window. He could see Strawberry Field from that window. Not his bedroom, but the back bedroom of Mendips. He also had a tree house in his backyard. He would have been able to see Strawberry Field from the tree house, and not only that, he would have been able to hear it as well. He would have been able to hear the kids playing. So it does seem like John, and by the way, I feel like I'm fully backed up in saying it, because years later John criticises Penny Lane and Paul McCartney writing about it, but in doing so he says all about the fact that Strawberry Field was about a location by his house, so he is singing about a field at the back of his house at a time when he couldn't possibly come back and visit again because Beatlemania stopped him from coming back. So that is hopefully quite helpful, maybe insightful for learning about John Lennon's early years and learning about Strawberry Field in connection to it. Because Strawberry Field these days, as I say, it's a beautiful place, but it's not necessarily the exact same place that John Lennon was hanging around in, because these days it's a John Lennon exhibition and they tell the story in early years of John Lennon and the story of the Salvation Army. They've also got the piano that he composed and recorded Imagine on inside Strawberry Field, which is really cool. So it's a very interesting crossover of religion and John Lennon and Imagine and, Abide With Me. It's a very interesting and strange crossover, but so is John's childhood, so is his upbringing, so is his life. John's upbringing is in no way consistent. So I find it very interesting now seeing Strawberry Field and seeing how confusing it can be for people when they come to visit. They really, quite often, don't get it. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes I don't, hence why it took me 35 minutes in the video to try and explain and get to the bottom, in brief, of John Lennon's childhood. Now, John's a complex character. I would be very interested to find out other people's opinions on him. Whenever I ask on tours who's got a favourite Beatle, Paul McCartney always wins, just so you know. But John's always in second, and I've found over the years that the big John Lennon fans are normally the ones who can be the most passionate of Beatle fans. But quite often the big John Lennon fans are the ones who really make him out to be a saint at the same time, which I think he certainly isn't. But one thing I love, and I think it's where really I want to finish this little podcast episode, the cool thing about John Lennon, the best thing, is for all his faults and failures and successes and achievements, for all his complexity, he told us all himself. There's nothing that can be said about John Lennon that he didn't share either in an interview, in his writing, or in his music. And I think that's a beautiful thing with John. He wore his heart on his sleeve, he didn't hide anything, and that's why He's such an incredible character, but I'm back in Strawberry Field. So come and visit us in Liverpool if you want to find out more about John. Give me a shout, drop me a follow to find out more.